Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, Reading the Grotesque. Winesburg, Ohio is a collection of loosely interconnected stories. For the most part, they take place in the same town of Winesburg, although a few backstories place characters in other locations, and with a few exceptions, they take place during the same period of time. The multi-generational Bentley family saga is one of these exceptions. A number of characters appear in more than one story. George Willard, for example, he appears in all but 6 of them, and his emotional development and maturation provides a kind of loose through narrative binding the stories together. But most of them focus not so much on George, but rather on the various people he encounters at his parents' hotel and as a beat reporter for the local newspaper, the Winesburg Eagle. So while the book has a motley, whimsical organization, its structure is not strictly determined by plot. Most of the stories can be read and enjoyed out of sequence, and even the handful of stories that are interconnected stand just as well on their own. However, reading them in their proper intended order and thinking about the rationale behind their arrangement places a greater emphasis on the central theme of the book as a whole, and that theme is the concept of the grotesque. If you turn to the dictionary, you will find several definitions of the word grotesque. This one from Merriam-Webster gives us a place to start: departing markedly from the natural, the expected, or the typical. Not many characters in Winesburg, Ohio seem typical. They often behave or speak in ways readers may not expect. In that sense, they are grotesque, and yet that doesn't go quite far enough towards explaining what Sherwood Anderson is trying to achieve. For one thing, the dictionary definition assumes a universal standard for what is natural or typical, but we of course know that what seems natural or typical to one person may not seem that way to another, and depends greatly on one's personal experience and life situation. The stories of Winesburg, Ohio offer a cross-section of American society. They are the stories of common people: doctors, school teachers, and day laborers, farmers, store clerks, and church pastors, men and women, the old and the young, the rich and the poor. For the term grotesque to apply to such a diversity of backgrounds and experiences, Anderson needs a more refined definition, a universal standard of naturalness, of normalcy, one that allows readers to understand not only what causes people to become grotesque, but also implicitly how to live a healthy, productive life, rich in meaning and possibility. This is the primary purpose of the first story in the collection, the Book of the Grotesque, which functions as a kind of prologue to those that follow. It's not much of a story, really. It concerns an unnamed old man, a writer, coming to terms with his physical decline and reflecting on his past and all the people he's encountered, most recently a carpenter whom he hired to raise the level of his bed to provide a better view out his window. For our purposes, what happens in the story is of relatively little importance. What matters more is the old writer's ideas about people, about life. The writer, we are told, had encountered many people in his lifetime and known them in a peculiarly intimate way that was different from the way in which you and I know people. So he's a kind of empath. He can see in people what most others cannot see. He looks into their hearts and minds, recognizes their motives and desires, and eventually comes to understand their individual grotesqueness, which in fact seems to be a common condition. In the bed, the narrator continues, the writer had a dream. Figures began to appear before his eyes. They were all grotesques. All of the men and women the writer had ever known had become grotesques. The narrator then tells us the old man created a written record of the lives of all the people he's known, and in doing so, he's provided a definition of the grotesque, a definition that can also be applied to the characters of Winesburg, Ohio. A simple statement of it would be something like this: that in the beginning, when the world was young, there were a great many thoughts, but no such thing as a truth. Man made the truths himself, and each truth was a composite of a great many vague thoughts. All about in the world were the truths, and they were all beautiful. There was the truth of virginity and the truth of passion, the truth of wealth and of poverty, of thrift and of profligacy, of carefulness and abandon. And then the people came along. Each, as he appeared, snatched up one of the truths, and some who were quite strong snatched up a dozen of them. It was the truths that made the people grotesques. The moment one of the people took one of the truths to himself, called it his truth, and tried to live his life by it, he became a grotesque, and the truth he embraced became a falsehood. I'm not going to attempt to paraphrase or summarize this definition of the grotesque. That's something you will do later on your own. However, it's important that you understand what the old writer means, because as we make our way through the rest of the book, you'll need to answer the following questions about the story's primary characters. Their names are provided on the table of contents page, which I'll show you later in this video. So the first question, what do characters say or do that makes them grotesque? What misconceptions do they have about themselves, their relationships, or their occupations? What ideas distort their view of the world and of other people? What events in the past caused them to become grotesque? Was it a specific event, family circumstances, or a romantic relationship? And finally, how does being grotesque affect them in the present? How does it impact their current relationships, careers, and status in the community? To help you with answering these questions and achieving a better understanding of the characters, I'm going to use Wing Biddlebaum as an example. He's the main character in the story that follows immediately after the Book of the Grotesque, titled Hands. So what does Wing Biddlebaum say or do that makes him grotesque? What misconceptions does he have about himself, his relationships, or his occupation? What ideas distort his view of the world and other people? His most obvious trait, the source of his quirky nickname, is the way he uses his hands to communicate. They are the piston rods of his machinery of expression, the narrator says at one point. Biddlebaum's excitement, his passion, the intensity of his ideas is registered in the energetic movement of his hands. And yet we also learn that this tendency makes him terribly anxious. He avoids conversation, and when he finds himself in situations where he does have to talk, he silences his hands by hiding them in his pockets or folding them under his arms. The story of Wing Biddlebaum is a story of hands. Their restless activity, like unto the beating of the wings of an imprisoned bird, had given him his name. Some obscure poet of the town had thought of it. The hands alarmed their owner. He wanted to keep them hidden away and looked with amazement at the quiet, inexpressive hands of other men who worked beside him in the fields or passed, driving sleepy teams on country roads. The one exception to his self-consciousness and reluctance, we learn, is when he spends time with George Willard. When he talked to George Willard, Wing Biddlebaum closed his fists and beat with them upon a table or on the walls of his house. The action made him more comfortable. If the desire to talk came to him when the two were walking in the fields, he sought out a stump or the top board of a fence, and with his hands pounding busily, talked with renewed ease. Initially, then, one might think that it's his hands that make him grotesque, and applying the dictionary definition of the term we looked at earlier, a case could certainly be made for that. It's a little weird, it's not typical, and yet, while talking to George, waving his hands enthusiastically and pounding on a fence, he speaks with strong conviction and sincere concern. He's critical of George, but he also offers some of the best advice George receives in the entire book. His spasmodic method may seem odd, but Biddlebaum comes across as benevolently sage, a figure of wisdom and experience. By a fence he had stopped, and beating like a giant woodpecker upon the top board had shouted at George Willard, condemning his tendency to be too much influenced by the people about him. "You are destroying yourself," he cried. "You have the inclination to be alone and to dream, and you are afraid of dreams. You want to be like others in town here. You hear them talk and you try to imitate them." He launched into a long, rambling talk, speaking as one lost in a dream. Out of the dream, Wing Biddlebaum made a picture for George Willard. In the picture, men lived again in a kind of pastoral golden age. Across a green, open country came clean-limbed young men to gather about the feet of an old man who sat beneath a tree in a tiny garden and who talked to them. Biddlebaum's strange manner seems harmless enough, and it hardly satisfies the criteria for the grotesque provided by the old man in the previous story. However, something more disturbing happens during one of his conversations with George. As he continues to speak, and as his message becomes more impassioned and visionary, he touches George, lays his hands on his shoulders. It's not the touching that's disturbing. That seems innocent, the way a parent might touch a child during a heartfelt conversation, or perhaps the way a pastor might touch a congregant during a moment of spiritual counsel, or the way a coach might touch an athlete during a pep talk. George doesn't seem bothered by it, but curiously, Biddlebaum himself does. Wing Biddlebaum became wholly inspired. For once he forgot the hands. Slowly they stole forth and lay upon George Willard's shoulders. Something new and bold came into the voice that talked. "You must try to forget all you have learned," said the old man. "You must begin to dream. From this time on, you must shut your ears to the roaring of the voices." Pausing in his speech, Wing Biddlebaum looked long and earnestly at George Willard. His eyes glowed. Again he raised the hands to caress the boy, and then a look of horror swept over his face. What Biddlebaum seems to believe is that there's something inherently wrong or perverse in his manner of expression, that despite his moral intelligence, he has no business dispensing his wisdom or giving advice, however sincere or well-intentioned. The next logical question, then, is how did he get to be this way? What's his origin story? What events in Wing Biddlebaum's past caused him to become grotesque? Was it a specific event, family circumstances, or a romantic relationship? One of the most important details we learn about his past is that he was formerly a school teacher, not in Winesburg, Ohio, but somewhere in Pennsylvania. And by all account, he was a good one. He had a positive influence on his students, and they loved him, as we see in this passage. Here and there went his hands, caressing the shoulders of the boys, playing about the tousled heads. As he talked, his voice became soft and musical. There was a caress in that also. In a way, the voice and the hands, the stroking of the shoulders and the touching of the hair were a part of the schoolmaster's effort to carry a dream into the young minds. By the caress that was in his fingers, he expressed himself. Under the caress of his hands, doubt and disbelief went out of the minds of the boys, and they began also to dream. But unfortunately, there was one student, we're informed, who loved him a little too much, which led to the rumors that not only destroyed Biddlebaum's teaching career, but nearly ended his life and began his transformation from Adolph Myers, that's his original name, into the grotesque shadow of his former self, Wing Biddlebaum. And then the tragedy. A half-witted boy of the school became enamored of the young master. In his bed at night he imagined unspeakable things, and in the morning went forth to tell his dreams as facts. Strange, hideous accusations fell from his loose-hung lips. Through the Pennsylvania town went a shiver. Hidden, shadowy doubts that had been in men's minds concerning Adolph Myers were galvanized into beliefs. To avoid being lynched by an angry mob, then, He flees to Ohio and gives up teaching to become a day laborer. His energetic fingers that once facilitated through touch the transmission of his grand ideas into the minds of his students have been reduced to picking strawberries when they're in season. So what is his life, what's left of it anyway, what does it look like now? How does being grotesque affect Wing Biddlebaum in the present? How does it impact his current relationships, career, and status in the community? Well, it's a sad life. He's a shell of the man he once was, frightened, lonely, and perhaps most tragically unfulfilled as he's unable to pursue his passion for guiding young boys into manhood. No longer a teacher, he lives the life of a cloistered monk, solitary, withdrawn from the world, and heartbreakingly silent. This passage, taken from the end of the story, is poignantly sad. When the rumble of the evening train that took away the express cars loaded with the day's harvest of berries had passed and restored the silence of the summer night, he went again to walk upon the veranda. In the darkness he could not see the hands, and they became quiet. Although he still hungered for the presence of the boy, that's George Willard, who was the medium through which he expressed his love of man, the hunger became again a part of his loneliness and his waiting. Lighting a lamp, Wing Biddlebaum washed the few dishes soiled by his simple meal, and setting up a folding cot by the screen door that led to the porch, prepared to undress for the night. A few stray white breadcrumbs lay on the cleanly washed floor by the table. Putting the lamp upon a low stool, he began to pick up the crumbs, carrying them to his mouth one by one with unbelievable rapidity. In the dense blotch of light beneath the table, the kneeling figure looked like a priest engaged in some service of his church. The nervous, expressive fingers flashing in and out of the light might well have been mistaken for the fingers of the devotee going swiftly through decade after decade of his rosary. Understanding Sherwood Anderson's concept of the grotesque and seeing it exemplified in the character of Wing Biddlebaum should guide your thinking about the characters that appear in the remaining stories. What you're looking at here are the preliminary pages of the first edition, published by B.W. Hipsch in 1919, and the table of contents, which is replicated in the edition we're using in this course. And here you, of course, see the first two stories, the Book of the Grotesque and Hands. You'll notice, too, that the Book of the Grotesque is the only story listed here that is not associated with a particular character. After Hands, concerning Wing Biddlebaum, there's Paper Pills concerning Dr. Reefy. If you happen to be wondering why I chose apples as the background image for this slide, the answer is in that story. And Paper Pills is followed by Mother, concerning George Willard's mother, Elizabeth. The last story, by the way, Departure, is the only one in the book explicitly linked to George Willard. Elizabeth and Dr. Reefy appear together towards the end of the book in the story Death, and they are the only two characters who are the focus of two separate and independent stories. Several others, however, are connected and have significant overlap between them. Most notably, there's the Bentley family saga, which consists of 4 stories spanning 3 generations of the Bentley family. George Willard does not appear in any of these stories. Then there's The Strength of God and The Teacher concerning Kate Swift, who's a kind of female version of Wing Biddlebaum. And these 2 stories overlap chronologically, which is interesting, and I'm not going to spoil it by saying too much here. To wrap up then, as you read the stories in Winesburg, Ohio, you'll need to think about how the focal characters conform to Sherwood Anderson's concept of the grotesque using the 3 questions presented in this video. What qualifies the character as grotesque? What happened in his or her past that led to this condition? And what are the consequences of it? There will be several homework assignments along the way to help you with this and prepare you for the essay you'll write at the end of this unit.